Gravity's Cascade. The 2-minute opening of Gravity is the closest any blockbuster has ever come to dramatizing a textbook orbital mechanics paper. Released in October 2013 and directed by Alfonso Cuarón, the film throws Sandra Bullock and George Clooney into the path of a debris cascade after a Russian anti-satellite missile strike sends fragments through the same orbital plane as the Space Shuttle and the Hubble Space Telescope. That cascade has a real name. It's called Kessler syndrome, named for NASA scientist Donald Kessler, who published the underlying paper in 1978 with Burton Coeur-Pellet while working at the Johnson Space Center's Environmental Effects Office. The film gets one big thing absolutely right and one big thing absolutely wrong, and that split is the whole story. The silence is correct. There is no atmosphere in orbit, so there is no propagation of sound, and Cuarón's destruction sequences honor that physics scrupulously. The visuals of the Hubble, the International Space Station, and Tiangong-1 were built from NASA reference imagery. What the film fakes is geometry. The Hubble orbits at roughly 540 kilometers. The station sits near 400, and Tiangong-1 was around 340. Astronauts and debris can't drift between them without massive propulsive burns, and a fragmentation field doesn't orbit as a tight 90-minute wave. Astronaut Chris Hadfield praised the station exteriors while flagging the interstation transit problem. Gravity won 7 Academy Awards and became the single most influential cultural reference point for orbital debris in modern history. It got the physics of silence right and the physics of orbital geometry catastrophically wrong, and that's exactly what makes it a perfect case study in selective realism. Hab Airlock Blowout. Ridley Scott's The Martian gives Mark Watney one of the most physically grounded disaster sequences in modern sci-fi, then breaks its own rules in the same scene. Released in October 2015 and based on Andy Weir's 2011 novel, the film follows the Ares 3 crew's surface habitat on Mars, a pressurized inflatable structure the script calls the Hab. Mid-film, fatigue from repeated cycling causes Airlock 1 to tear free from the Hab while Watney is inside, launching the entire chamber across the Martian surface. The decompression breach destroys his potato crop, the only food supply he has. The cause is correct. Fatigue failure in a repeatedly stressed pressurized seal is exactly the kind of slow-developing catastrophe real engineers worry about. The effect is where the physics breaks. Physicist Robert Berger noted that a hole that large would release a single puff and stop. It wouldn't launch the chamber across the surface as the film shows. Watney's duct tape and tarp repair is the second issue. Average Martian surface temperatures sit around minus 63 Celsius, which would freeze most adhesives long before they could form a working seal. NASA consulted on the production through Jim Green, then director of planetary science. The Hab blowout shows how sci-fi often gets the cause right and the visual consequence wrong. Salyut 7 Rescue. The most physically accurate space station rescue ever filmed is the one that actually happened, then got dramatized by the people who lived it. Salyut 7, the 2017 Russian film directed by Klim Shipenko, dramatizes the Soyuz T-13 docking mission of June 1985. Real cosmonauts Vladimir Janibekov and Viktor Savinik were sent to rendezvous with Salyut 7 after it lost power in February 1985 and went silent. The station was tumbling. It was broadcasting no telemetry. The crew had to estimate proximity using a handheld laser rangefinder, and Janibekov manually matched the station's rotation before docking with the forward port. It was the first time in history a dead station was revived. The film replicated that docking sequence with technical accuracy. Production built custom rigs, used multiple suspension methods, and choreographed zero-gravity movement so the manual rendezvous reads as real on screen. Cosmonaut consultation on set was confirmed in production documentation. Where the film breaks from reality is the dramatic frame around the docking. The fire that climaxes the third act was invented. There was no fire aboard Soyuz T-13, and filmmakers borrowed the 1997 Mir oxygen generator fire to manufacture tension. The real repair mission lasted over 3 months, not the compressed days the film shows. The screenplay also fabricates a parallel American space shuttle Challenger launch attempting to steal Salyut 7, and Challenger never flew in June 1985. No such mission existed. The docking sequence is arguably the most accurate ever filmed because it's reproducing a known event rather than inventing one. Where the film stretches is in dramatic accelerants: a fire, a Cold War subplot, a compressed timeline. The base layer of physics holds, the dramatic frame does not. Stowaway's math. Stowaway is the rare space disaster film where the central crisis is a spreadsheet problem. Released in April 2021 on Netflix and directed by Joe Penna, the film follows a four-person crew aboard a transit ship on a Mars-bound trajectory. The disaster is mundane and devastating at once. A stowaway is found unconscious inside a control panel, and the impact damages the carbon dioxide scrubber. The crew switches to emergency lithium hydroxide canisters and accelerates an onboard algae experiment to grow replacement oxygen, but only half the algae survives, mathematically producing just enough for 3 crew members instead of 4. That's the whole engine of the story. Retired NASA astronaut Daniel Barry, space tether expert Robert Hoyt, and science communicator Scott Manley served as on-set consultants. The spinning tether artificial gravity design and the spacewalk sequence drew widespread praise for orbital realism. The inaccuracies are documented and small. Liquid oxygen stored in the booster would boil away long before retrieval, and the ship is shown with only one scrubber when a year-long interplanetary mission would have built-in redundancy. Stowaway uses oxygen arithmetic as its entire dramatic engine. The realism is in the math, not in the special effects. This is the rare disaster film where the central question is who breathes, not who explodes. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, I post videos like this all the time. Subscribing would really help out. Thanks. Icarus Two Burn. Sunshine made a stellar bomb the size of Manhattan plausible by hiring a particle physicist to write the crew biographies. Released in 2007 and directed by Danny Boyle from a script by Alex Garland, the film follows a crew of 8 aboard the Icarus II as they attempt to deliver a payload designed to reignite a dying sun in the year 2057. Particle physicist Brian Cox, then at CERN, served as scientific consultant. Cox proposed a cue ball explanation for the sun's premature dimming and wrote the characters' professional backstories so the crew would behave like real scientists. The ship is dominated by a massive solar shield, and the disaster sequence begins when a navigational error damages the shield panel alignment. Once the shield orientation slips, exposed sections of the ship would superheat catastrophically. Cox said publicly that his job was to identify what was wrong, and then Boyle and Garland decided whether real physics or the story served the scene better. The decision to keep flames behaving with Earth-like flicker rather than the spherical zero-gravity combustion fire actually produces was a known dramatic choice, not an error of ignorance. Sunshine is the cleanest example of a film that knew the physics and chose drama anyway. The shield failure sequence is correct in cause and exaggerated in effect. I.S.S. Gravity Fight. I.S.S. is the only major sci-fi film to take the physics of a fistfight in zero gravity seriously. Released in January 2024 and directed by Gabriella Cowperthwaite from a screenplay by Nick Shafir, the film opens with a Cold War going hot on Earth and the American and Russian crew aboard the International Space Station receiving orders to seize control of the station. The disaster is the station itself becoming a battleground for 2 crews who can't use Earth-style violence against each other. Cowperthwaite committed to demonstrating what slight touches do to bodies in microgravity, where the smallest contact sends a person spinning uncontrollably. The film shows blood in zero gravity forming floating spheres rather than splattering. Kira's adjustments to station life are documented as carefully as the action. Zipped-in sleep restraints, microgravity bathroom use, bungee-tethered treadmill exercise, all of it consistent with documented station crew routines. Cowperthwaite engaged with former station crew during pre-production to choreograph movement, and critics noted that some confrontations escalate faster than realistic microgravity grappling would actually allow. The realism lives in the smallest motions, not in the big set pieces. The disaster works because microgravity is a constraint on every action, not just a visual flair the film deploys when it remembers. Life's containment breach. Life turned the station into a horror film by getting the boring parts right. Released in March 2017 and directed by Daniel Espinosa, the disaster is a Mars sample organism named Calvin escaping containment in the station's Destiny Lab module. The interior was augmented in size for camera coverage, but otherwise modeled on the current configuration. And the filmmakers consulted NASA on sample return mission timelines, estimating 6 to 7 years for transit. Astronaut Chris Hadfield publicly critiqued the oxygen candle sequence the crew uses as an anti-Calvin weapon. The candle wouldn't function as the film shows in microgravity. The horror works because the station feels right. Discovery 1 Pod Bay. Stanley Kubrick spent $750,000 in 1968 to build a rotating set, and the result is still the gold standard for how a real station would behave. 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Kubrick and co-written with Arthur C. Clarke, gave Discovery 1 a 38-foot centrifuge habitat that matched real centrifugal gravity math, with angular velocity around 0.1 radians per second and a period near 60 seconds, generating Earth-like pull at the outer rim. The film's lack of sound across every explosion, impact, and EVA is physically correct, and it was deliberately preserved against studio pressure. Frank Poole's death outside Discovery 1 is the disaster centerpiece. HAL 9000 severs his oxygen line and propels his body away into vacuum. The famous emergency airlock reentry by Dave Bowman approximates a real explosive decompression scenario. The body can survive brief vacuum exposure with closed lungs, consistent with NASA and Soviet decompression studies from the 1960s. The pod bay door refusal scene is built around an internal mechanical lockout rather than a destruction event, an unusually realistic depiction of how station systems actually fail. Astronaut Leroy Chiao has cited 2001 as one of the most accurate space films ever made. Almost 6 decades later, it remains the realism benchmark for rotating habitat physics. The constraint is the spectacle, Marooned's Capsule. 4 years before Apollo 13, a sci-fi film predicted the exact scenario NASA would soon face for real. Marooned, released in 1969 and directed by John Sturges, stars Gregory Peck and Gene Hackman. The disaster is a 3-man Iron Man 1 crew stranded after a service module engine failure during return. Production used an actual Block 1 Apollo Command Module boilerplate as the interior set reference, and NASA, North American Aviation, and Philco Ford supplied design assistance for chairs, headsets, and orbiting lab modules. The film released in October 1969, 6 months before the real Apollo 13 crisis in April 1970. It won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. Marooned built its disaster from real NASA blueprints, then watched reality nearly mirror its plot months later. Europa Report Mission. Europa Report is the rare disaster film that treats the spacecraft itself as more dangerous than the alien moon it visits. Released in August 2013 and directed by Sebastian Cordero, the found footage format follows the Europa 1 crew on a private mission to Jupiter's moon, Europa. Astrobiologist Kevin Hand of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory served as scientific consultant, and set designer Eugenio Caballero, working with NASA and SpaceX input, built a fully practical ship interior with functional zero-gravity wirework. The Europa surface visuals were rendered from real Galileo mission data and JPL surface mapping. The disaster sequence is a communications array failure followed by a surface thaw breach that claims crew members during the landing operation. Critics noted that the film's most significant inaccuracy involves the ice shell itself. Current modeling suggests it's thicker than the film implies, and a spacecraft would not breach it as easily as depicted. The radiation environment near Jupiter is also far more hostile than the film visualizes. Real crew exposure would be lethal within hours. Europa Report is one of very few sci-fi films to treat the spacecraft as a single point of failure rather than a backdrop. Each disaster beat traces to a real engineering risk. Endurance docking. Interstellar's most physically extreme sequence is not the black hole. It is a spinning module trying to grab a tumbling one. Released in November 2014 and directed by Christopher Nolan, the film hired Nobel-winning theoretical physicist Kip Thorne as scientific consultant and executive producer. The Endurance is a modular, ring-shaped deep space vessel with 12 outer modules and a central hub. Artificial gravity is generated by rotating the ring at 5.5 revolutions per minute, producing centrifugal force that approximates Earth gravity at the outer rim. The disaster sequence is a docking port explosion during the encounter with Dr. Mann, which sends the Endurance into uncontrolled tumble. Cooper's manual matching maneuver requires the docking pod to synchronize spin with the tumbling Endurance, and the math is consistent with real angular momentum coupling. Thorne published The Science of Interstellar in 2014, detailing which sequences were physically rigorous and which involved approved dramatic license. The 5.5 revolutions per minute figure is consistent with engineering studies on sustainable artificial gravity without inducing motion sickness in the crew. Gyroscopic stabilization of the ring is physically real. The spin resists external deflection from impacts or maneuvering forces. The endurance docking is a working physics demonstration. The spin matching maneuver, which audiences read as Hollywood gymnastics, is the most physically rigorous docking sequence in modern sci-fi. The film treats angular momentum as the actual antagonist of the scene. Mission to Mars breach. Mission to Mars built its entire second act crisis around a single micrometeoroid impact, and the physics holds up better than the film's reputation. Released in March 2000 and directed by Brian De Palma, the disaster is the resupply ship being breached by a micrometeoroid strike during a transit course correction. The crisis ends in an untethered EVA where Tim Robbins' character ends his own life after a rescue attempt comes up short. Micrometeoroid impact at orbital velocities is a documented station risk. NASA tracks objects down to 1 centimeter and shields the station against impacts up to that scale. Once a crew member separates from the ship without thrust, recovery is mathematically impossible without external aid. The breach sequence demonstrates a real engineering risk that the film's reputation tends to overshadow. Jamestown Crisis. For All Mankind built a moon-based disaster around an armed confrontation scenario that, in this alternate timeline, would have killed the lunar program in 1983. The show premiered in November 2019 on Apple TV+, created by Ronald D. Moore, Matt Wolpert, and Ben Nadivi. The premise is that the Soviet Union landed on the moon first in 1969, accelerating the American lunar program. Jamestown is the United States lunar base, built as a ring-shaped habitat using Apollo lunar module components and Skylab-derived modules. Production consulted former astronauts and NASA engineers to verify mission profiles, hardware design, and operational realism. The second season builds toward a Jamestown Crisis involving a Cold War armed confrontation inside the base, one of very few sci-fi works to dramatize a lunar firefight with realistic ballistic physics. Lunar gravity is consistently maintained at 1/6 Earth gravity through camera frame rate manipulation at 32 frames per second and choreographed movement on set. Apollo lunar module references in the Jamestown design are detailed enough that real Apollo astronauts have publicly identified them on screen. For All Mankind is the only modern sci-fi work to commit fully to a permanently inhabited lunar station as the disaster setting. The Jamestown arc treats the hardware and the human stakes with documentary-grade fidelity. It's the closing argument for why grounded sci-fi disasters land harder than spectacle. If this was worth your time, consider subscribing to keep up with all future uploads. Thanks for watching.